Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. Dark Hecate, the maiden, mother, crone, most commonly known today as the feminine counterpart to the horned god, a concept that was popularised by folklorist Robert Graves in his work, The White Goddess. In this book, Graves theorises that there's an archetypal triad of goddesses found in mythology of various European cultures. But, with all due respect, Robert Graves, though impressive in many ways, he hasn't got the best reputation when it comes to scholarship, due to his awful habit of actually not bringing in any primary resources to his discussions. Though he's a fantastic novelist and poet, a scholar Graves was not, and The White Goddess, though a fun read, is more akin to a conspiratorial theorist writing than anything related to actual mythology, history, and linguistic scholarship. So, today we're going to move aside the more contemporary misconceptions of Hecate, which have been transmuted through the evolution of more modern paganism, and explore the ancient goddesses of witchcraft, night, and ghosts, and briefly look at how her role has changed and evolved over time, with an emphasis placed on the different elements of her according to the evolving social relations in mythology. And this video is actually a request from Gina and Lemez and a couple of anonymous people from my Google Forms, so thank you very much for requesting this video. So, the first time I met Hecate was actually in Shakespeare's Macbeth as a 10-year-old little girl. You see, the section is in Act 3. The three weird sisters are scolded by the goddess for going behind her back and conjuring a prophecy for Macbeth without her knowledge. Now, interestingly enough, Hecate is not a fan of Macbeth. She calls him a spiteful and wrathful wayward son who exploits others for his own ends. And she's not wrong, we all know that. But it's interesting that the judgment of Macbeth by the goddess of witchcraft and the ruler of these quote-unquote wicked, outcast, socially perceived evil witches highlights how truly heinous Macbeth is, and how misunderstood the witches are. So, something I've already mentioned is that according to modern neo-paganism, Hecate is regarded as the mother, the maiden, and the crone, and Graves claims that Hecate was the, quote, original and most predominant ancient triple moon goddess. But I'm afraid he was telling porkies, as this certainly wasn't the case. I mean, for starters, there aren't any ancient sources relating Hecate to the mother, maiden, crone archetype as seen in modern neo-paganism. Artemis and Hecate were classified as maidens, but not all three. And as for the number 3, well, the Greeks loved their numbers, and women do often come in threes. We have, for example, the 3 Moirai, and it was them, not Hecate, who were regarded by the Orphic tradition as representing the 3 divisions of the moon, the crescent, the half, and the full. Not Hecate, and this is all according to the 3rd century BCE grammarian Epigenes, or Epigenes, I've heard it said different ways. So in ancient Greece, it was the Moirai who were seen as depicting the 3 stages of womanhood that the neo-pagans now attribute to Hecate, and what Graves said was the quote-unquote original, but it wasn't Hecate at all, it was the Moirai. So the Moirai consist usually of a young girl, known as the spinner of the thread of life, i.e. they would be the maiden, an older woman, and the measurer, the mother, and then an elderly woman, the cutter, representing birth, active life, and death, and they would be in the crone. So again, we have the Moirai representing the maiden, mother, crone, not Hecate. It wasn't until the late 4th century when the grammarian Servius made an explicit connection between the Moirai and Hecate that her symbolism morphed into their role. So what Servius actually said about these phases and the roles of the Moirai were, quote, some call the same goddess Lucina, Diana, and Hekate because they assign to one goddess the 3 powers of birth, growth, and death. Some say that Lucina is the goddess of birth, Diana of growth, and Hecate of death. On account of this threefold power, they have imagined her as a threefold and three-form, and for that reason they built temples at the meeting of the three roads. Later, in more modern scholarship, we have Jane Ellen Harrison, who loved the idea of female trinities, and she ran home with this idea. And it's very likely that her interpretations of the tripleness of women in ancient Greece resulted in the singular triple moon goddess that of Hecate that we have today. So, if we're going to be harsh, we have modern scholars to blame for the contortion of Hecate compared to her, ancient understandings of her, but let's face it, it's pretty cool, so we'll give modern scholars a pass on all this, because the contemporary understanding of Hecate is incredible, but it is not exactly how she was presented in ancient Greece, in fact, quite far from it. Well, not that far from it. I'll give you all the deeds, let's break it down. So, for ancient Hecate, she wasn't a triple goddess. She was much more than that. As one of the goddesses of the underworld, Hecate was chthonic. She was the chthonic goddess of the underworld. She was also the goddess of magic and witchcraft. She was also known as the Nyctipolos, she who wanders at night, and the Scalica goddess, the leader of dogs. As a goddess of the crossroads, she was a trioditis, i.e. she of the triple road, translated into trivia by the Romans. We'll get onto that topic later. And the Enodia, she of the road. And in her capacity as a helper to mortals, she's also known as the Soteria, the saviour, the Atelos, the tender, and the nurse of the young, and the bringer of light, the Phosphoros. So as you can see, she is far more than just three things. She was a lot. Now, Hecate's origins aren't exactly set in stone either. With all ancient things, the ancient writers have their differing origin stories and different parentage. So the most famous example is Hesiod. Hesiod, among other writers, claim that she was the daughter of the Titan Perseus and Asteroe. But Musaeus of Athens claims that she is the daughter of Asteroe and Zeus. Then we have the lyric poet Bacchylides, who doesn't give her traditional parentage and instead claims that she sprung from night itself, whilst Euripides claims that she is the daughter of Leto. In Thessalian legend, she is said to have been the daughter of Admetus and a Phaeacian woman, and was believed to be close of kin to Aeetes and Circe of Colchis. The Hesiodic fragments claims that she has no siblings, and that no clan or tribe claimed to be descendants of her. According to most traditions, she appears to have been an ancient Thracian divinity and a Titan, and the only Titan to serve under Zeus after the Titanomachy. And Zeus must have really liked her because he gave her the power to rule over the heaven, earth, and sea, bestow mortals with wealth, victory and wisdom and good luck and prosperity, and withhold these elements from the mortals if she thought they deserved it. Now, this very broad stroke of power bestowed upon Hecate led to her downfall in terms of congruent literature and ancient imagery, as throughout history she was confounded and identified with several other divinities, including Demeter, Rhea, Artemis and Persephone herself, and eventually became a mystic goddess, to whom the mysteries were celebrated in Samothrace and Aegina. However, this conflation explains why she was so easily included in the Homeric hymn of Demeter. So I've already discussed the Homeric hymn of Demeter, but let's talk about Hecate's role in it. According to the hymn, she was, besides Helios, the only divinity who, from her cave, observed the abduction of Persephone. Now, this will be important later, so remember it. Helios and Hecate, according to the hymn of Demeter, were the only two gods to have witnessed the abduction. So, with a torch in her hand, the fearless chthonic goddess defied Zeus and Hades alongside Demeter to go and find Persephone, demonstrating her role as a defender of mothers and maidens and the protector of justice. After Persephone was found, Hecate remained with her as her attendant and companion, though interestingly enough, she is primarily described as Persephone's companion for when she leaves the underworld, rather than when she's just in the underworld. which is a confusing detail containing, Hecate's role as a deity of the underworld. However, Hecate's role in the myth of Persephone demonstrates her acting upon her crossroads/boundaries role. Hecate's early depiction demonstrates her plethora of functions related to entrances and exits, from geographical borders, city walls, doors and crossroads, to the realms of inside and outside the world of the living. Additionally, as the only free Titan left after the Titanomachy, she became the liminal goddess working between the conventions of the Olympians and the Titans, a feature which was reflected with her epithets within the cults and titles: Apotropia, Enodia, Propylaea, Triodia, and Clydakos. We have a lot to cover about Hecate, so before we get any further, let's take a moment to thank today's sponsor, which is Squarespace. Now, as you know, I've built all my main business websites over the past few years with Squarespace because I love how intuitive and easy it makes website design and layout, and I'm very excited for my new launching happening with my podcast website associated with this channel. I don't know anything about coding, which has made using other website platforms incredibly frustrating, but with Squarespace I can just drag and drop my content where I want it. And if you're a creator like me who wants to expand your revenue stream, then Squarespace is an all-in-one platform that makes it easy for you to monetize your content and expertise in a way that fits your brand. Squarespace Member Area lets you sell your courses or classes to your followers, and Squarespace also has an inbuilt email campaign option where you can collect your email subscribers and convert them into loyal customers, all from your website. And the built-in analytics feature gives you insight into who's visiting your site, the traffic sources, the time they spend on your site, most read content, audience, geography, and so much more. So if you want to expand your business or just build a beautiful site for your blogging pleasure, then go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/lady of the library to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you Squarespace for sponsoring today's video, and now let's really dissect how Hecate became to be the mother of witchcraft. So, as only a minor character in the stories of Demeter and Artemis, it wasn't until the 5th century BCE that we see Hecate more regularly in Greek art and literature. She's typically portrayed on Greek pottery as a young woman carrying a torch or a key, both reminders of her function as the night deity and a guardian of the gates of Hades, and a goddess of boundaries. On one 5th century BCE Attic vase, we'd see a woman offering the goddess a puppy and a basket of cakes. So, Hecate was a woman of fantastic taste. Now, obviously, if you're associated with Hecate in a shape or form, you've probably picked up on the symbolism of her 3 faces, her tripleness. Sometimes in classical and Hellenistic periods, she appeared as a 3-faced goddess on a single body, and other times she is a 3-faced and 3-bodied goddess. As the goddess of the crossroads, it's understandable that each of her bodies faces a different direction from one another, and it's usually around a column. Known as the Hecatea, the first example of the triple Hecate form is credited to a figure which guarded the entrance of the Acropolis of Athens, the Hecate Epipri Rigidia, which means on the ramparts, by the 5th century BCE sculptor Alcamenes. The 2nd century BCE Pergamon of Zeus has a 3-headed Hecate attacking a snake-like giant, helped by a dog. And because she is the goddess of boundaries, it will be of no surprise to you that it was a common practice to place images of her on city walls, and in particular at city gates, entrances to sacred sites, and the doorway of private homes. So let's talk about her faces. In Egyptian-inspired Greek esoteric writing connected with Hermes Trismegistus, and in the Greek magical papyri of the late antiquity, Hecate is described as having 3 heads, 1 dog, 1 serpent, and 1 horse. In other representations, her animal heads include those of a cow and a boar. In the Orphic Argonautica, not to be confused with the Artonautica of Apollonius, Hecate is described as having a terrible appearance, either with 3 bodies and 3 heads, and 1 of a horse, the 2nd of a dog, and the 3rd of a lion. So, why these animals? Well, we know that lions have actually been associated with Hecate in early artwork from Asia Minor, as well as in later coins and literature, including the Chaldean oracles, And the most obvious symbol to dissect is the dog head, because sadly, dogs were a major sacrificial animal in ancient Greece, especially for Hecate. I know, we talk a lot about ewes and pigs, but dogs not so much. In Book 23 of the Iliad, we witness Patroclus sacrificing 2 of his 9 dogs by slitting their throats and tossing them into the pyre. The Spartans also slaughtered dogs to ensure victory in battle, for example, and these sacrifices could be large-scale, as demonstrated by archaeologists who in 1937, when excavating in Agora, the main marketplace of Athens, they discovered a well containing bones of hundreds of people, including approximately 450 newborns and more than 100 dogs. According to Lynn M. Snyder, who examined the bones from the well, the infants had most likely died of natural causes, but the dogs were, quote, most likely sacrificed as part of the purification ritual after birth, whether successful or not. So several ancient Greek sources identify dogs as the victims of choice to cleanse the pollution caused by both death and childbirth. And we have seen examples of how dogs were sometimes sacrificed to Hecate, and the leftovers of sacred suppers in her name, which were also left out for the hounds. Another reason why one of her heads may have been a dog is that it's believed it symbolises Queen Hecuba. So, after the fall of Troy, Odysseus takes Queen Hecuba as his captive, but during the voyage back to Greece, she murdered the Thracian king and was stoned by the locals. And in some myths, she throws herself off a boat, and in others, as punishment, the gods transform Hecuba into a black dog. So rather than being murdered and stoned, she throws herself off, but she's still turned into this black dog. And it is after that that she becomes the familiar to the goddess Hecate. Now, this myth aligns Hecate with the goddess known as Bendis, who is the Thracian goddess of the moon and hunting. I know, it's like Artemis, I know, it gets really, pulled together. Anyway, Bendis was worshipped with Bacchic-like orgies in the wilds of Thrace, and was offered dogs as sacrificial animals as well. And it's important to note that Bendis isn't a tit-for-tat of Hecate, nor is Bendis an epithet for Hecate. Rather, she was a goddess the Greeks identified with Hecate, Artemis, and Selene, but not the same thing. It'll get worse when the Romans come on board, don't worry. Additionally, the Hecuba dog was not Hecate's only familiar. She also had a polecat, or a weasel, who was also known to be the product of a punishment by transformation, though the origins of the polecat, again, have various mythologies. So one myth states that the polecat was actually the metamorphosed witch Gale, who was extremely incontinent and had abnormal sexual desires, resulting in her metamorphosis at the hands of Hecate. Another myth, however, claims that the polecat is the midwife of Alcmena, who was called Galinthias. So, when Alcmena was in labour, Zeus's wife, Hera, was very jealous, and she sent her daughter Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, to sit outside Alcmena's bedroom and with her legs crossed and held together by both hands with intertwined fingers, which magically delayed the delivery in order to foil Zeus's plans for the birth of Heracles, aka Hercules. So Alcmena's labour continued for days until Galinthias, in some accounts, aided by the Furies, tricked Eileithyia by announcing the baby's birth. And this started Eileithyia, who unclasped her hands, and resulting in Heracles' birth. So furious, one of the goddesses, either in some stories it's Hera, in others it's Eileithyia, transformed Galinthias into a weasel or a polecat. And the goddess Hecate took pity on her and made her an attendant, and Heracles later built a temple for her. So, how did Hecate evolve over time in Greek mythology to become the Hecate that we know today? As we've already established, Hecate's earliest appearance in literature was Hesiod's Theogony in the 8th century BCE, and was a goddess of great honour, with domains in the sky, the earth and the sea. Hecate's role in the underworld doesn't really occur until much later in Greek myth tradition, and most notably, it's absent from the Homeric epics during very detailed descriptions of the underworld. However, in much later writings, she does play a core role in the underworld. And her association with the underworld largely evolved from her role as the goddess between the crossroads and boundaries. So over time, this goddess of purifications and expiations became associated with the ruler of the departed, the one responsible for denying or aiding the transition of demons, ghosts, chaos, damage, and intruders. Additionally, she was the protector of the oikos, the household, and was thus supposed to deny bad entities entrance into homes unless it was necessary to balance out the realms. By the 5th century BCE, Hecate had become to be strongly associated with ghosts, which may have been due to her conflation with the Thessalian goddess Enodia, meaning travel, who travelled the earth with retinue of ghosts and was depicted on coinage wearing a leafy crown and holding torches, which was iconography very strongly associated with Hecate. Then by the 3rd century BCE, Hecate's role in the underworld was more deeply established by ancient writers. Theocritus connects Hecate to the underworld through her iconography of the keys, claiming that Hecate was responsible for opening and closing the gates of death. Similarly, the Greek magical papyri considers Hecate to be the guardian of keys to Tartaros, and later Virgil despite noting that Hecate is powerful both in heaven and hell, depicted her accompanied by Stygian gods. And there's a chance that this association of her as a key holder and gatekeeper in the underworld connects her to the many-headed dog of the underworld, Cerberus or Cerberus, who was also in charge of guarding the gates and ensuring people enter the realm of the dead, stay there. The only difference between the two is that as a liminal figure, Hecate can also guide souls back to the upper world should they need to or wish to, something which I've already covered in my essay about the Greek afterlife and the underworld. So by the 1st century CE, Hecate's chthonic and nocturnal character led to her becoming more heavily associated with witchcraft, witches, magic and sorcery. In Lucas Phasaelia, the witch Enrictho invokes Hecate as, quote, Persephone, who is the third and lowest aspect of Hecate, the goddess we witches revere, and describes her as a rotting goddess with a pallid, decaying body who has to wear a mask when she visits the gods in heaven. Then we have a connection with the moon, Hecate, and me, Cinzia. Well, okay, not really me, but my name, Cinzia, which is an epithet for the goddess Diana, who is largely associated with Hecate, and their figures often overlap to the point that they blend into one figure in ancient Italy. So, because of her tripleness, another triple nature Hecate was conflated with was that of the moon, the sky, Diana, hunting and the earth, and then herself, Hecate, the underworld. Hecate's association with Helios, which we touched on, in literary sources and especially in cursing magic, has been cited as evidence for her lunar nature. However, I should stress that her overt association between the moon and Hecate and the lunar nature comes much later, which is why I'm going to use the word Diana rather than Artemis, because it's very much a Roman thing rather than an ancient Greek thing. After all, there is no artwork before the Roman period connecting Hecate to the moon. But remember that thing I told you to talk about? Remember in your head about the Homeric hymn to Demeter? We saw Helios and Hecate working together to inform Demeter of Persephone's abduction. And this, some people believe, is an example of the sun and the moon working together to inform others of things happening on Earth, because they can witness everything at all times from above the Earth. Thus, arguably, her role alongside Helios implies that Hecate is a representative of the moon in this circumstance. And this isn't the only ancient Greek associations with Hecate and the moon. I mean, for example, we have Sophocles' lost play, The Root Cutters, where Helios is described as Hecate's spear. Quote, O sun, our lord and sacred fire, the spear of Hecate of the roads, which she carries as she attends her mistress in the sky. Okay, so this speech from the Root Cutters may or may not be an intentional association of Hecate with the moon, but we don't have any more of the fragments, so we can't really analyse it further. And then we have Seneca's Medea, who invokes her patron Hecate, whom she addresses as moon, orb of the night, and triple form. We also have further examples from antiquity where Hecate and the moon goddess Selene are frequently identified with each other, and a number of Greek and non-Greek deities. But then, much later in ancient Italy, the triple unity of the lunar goddesses Diana, Luna, and Hecate become ubiquitous features in depictions of sacred groves, where Hecate/Trivia marked intersections and crossroads along with other liminal deities. And yes, to make this super confusing, Trivia, I've heard it pronounced different ways, but Trivia was an epithet for both Diana and Hecate, which conflated the two figures even more to the point where the Romans celebrated the multiple identities of Diana as Hecate, Luna, and Trivia. So all that is to say is basically I'm Hecate. Anyway, over time, Hecate's original pre-Hellenistic form became largely lost to history, and Hesiod's treatment of the deity folded her into the Greek pantheon. Hecate's role as a deity of the underworld did not become a huge feature until the time of the Greek tragedians, who connected Hecate to witchcraft and death. And from there, her heavy association with evil and witchcraft only grew in prominence until, by medieval period, European traditions almost exclusively depicted Hecate as the goddess of witchcraft and the moon. So let's talk about her name for a second, because again, this adds to the complexity of Hecate's origin story. The origins of Hecate's name, conceptualization, and character are still up for debate amongst scholars today, with some believing that she is Anatolian in origin rather than Greek, even though she is associated largely as a Greek goddess by the Greeks. Now, I hope many of you humour me here, because I like to make all my videos as accessible as possible to everyone in regards of your understanding of ancient history, so let me just take this opportunity to clarify the distinction between the Greeks and the Anatolians to those unfamiliar, as it can be confusing, especially considering the Anatolians are also known as the Anatolian Greeks, the Asiatic Greeks, and even the Asia Minor Greeks. The Anatolians were Indo-European speaking peoples of the Anatolian Peninsula in present-day Turkey, identified by their use of now extinct Anatolian languages, and the most well-known of these being the Hittite. So these languages were gradually supplanted by the Greek at the beginning of the Mycenaean times, once the western coast attracted settlers from mainland Greece. So from around 2000 until 1000 BCE, 3 tribes of people moved from northern European to the mainland of Greece. So first we had the Ionians, then the Achaeans, and then last the Dorians. And then around 1050 BCE, when the Dorian tribes invaded mainland Greece, the Ionians, who lived near the city of Attica, left, crossed the Aegean Sea, and colonised the west coast of Asia Minor, i.e. Anatolia, and with this colonisation saw the domination of the Greek language. So what has anything of this got to do with Hecate? Well, her name seems to be Greek, and she has been largely accepted as a Hellenic deity, even by the Greeks. However, some scholars have pointed out that despite this, she's been pretty left out by Greek tribes in early worship and literature. As I already mentioned, there's no mention of her in the Homeric epics, or the Iliad, the Odyssey, and not even the fragments of the Homeric epics, which is of note, especially considering the catabasis, the journey to the underworld in the Odyssey. She's never mentioned, despite having heavy importance in the Greek religion. And it only comes much later though, and through her association with Demeter and Artemis, and the later Greek writers give her inconsistent origin stories, which probably is due to her lack of presence in early Greek tribal worship and literature. Additionally, there aren't many temples or images of her associated with prehistoric period or legend, and the magic practices performed in her name of Hecate and the sorcery that made her a form of terror are not Hellenic in nature. So scholars who argue that she is not of Greek origin, but of Anatolian, specifically Carian or Carian origin, also argue that her personal names are formed from Hecate, like that of Hekateos, the geographer, or Hekatomus, that's such a mouthful, who gave his name to the dynasty of Masolos, occur primarily in Caria during the 5th and the 4th centuries BCE. So these scholars argue that her Carian cult was introduced to the Greek mainland from Asia Minor in the Archaic period, and that contamination with witches and demons, e.g. happened in Thessaly, and that eroded and infernalized her Olympian stature, transforming her into the Hecate that we know in later traditions, the recipient of table scraps and canine blood. These scholars also argue that she appears in her original Carian or Carian form in the earliest literary monument to her cult, that being the long passage of her in Hesiod's Theogony, lines 411 to 52. Now, Hesiod comes across as pretty big fanboy of Hecate in this section. He praises her for more than any of the titans whom Zeus favoured, and she's said to have her portion of land, sea and sky, and mediates appropriation of gods and blessings conferred upon men, which is a pretty big deal. Now, this is important because Hesiod's origins come from Asia Minor, because although he was born in mainland Greece, his family were from Asia Minor. And additionally, this is important because we have what archaeologists now call today the Sanctuary or Temple of Hecate at Legina, which is located in the southwestern modern-day Turkey, which was once called Caria or Caria. Caria or Caria, I've heard it both ways, resisted Greek influence until the Hellenistic period, between 323 to 31 BCE. And this temple of Hecate is said to have been built around 125 BCE, and it eventually fused Hellenistic and Carian and Carian cultures. Excavations have found evidence of ritual activity earlier than 125 BCE at the site, with the temple having been built on top of buried religious offerings from the 4th to 2nd centuries. The most notable find on the site was on the west frieze of her temple, which depicts Hecate standing in a prominent position in the midst of the Titanomachy. The friezes around the temple, she's identified in them by the iconographical torches, and most notably in one frieze, Hecate is depicted in the centre, her cloak billowing, as she runs towards Kronos with a bundled object, which is the rock that was passed off as baby Zeus in her arms. In the frieze, Hecate, serving as a midwife or nurse, looks anxiously back towards Rhea as she plays this critical role in what brings about the necessary fall of the Titans once and for all. Now, interesting, in the Theogony, Hecate doesn't play this role, but the connection with her importance in this frieze to Hesiod's passage of her demonstrates that the builders at Legina were intentional in creating a profile of their goddess as a powerful figure whose purview over the affairs of humans and the role as an intermediary between the divine and the mortal made her an ideal civic patron. But then there are other scholars who completely refute all the Carian evidence of Hecate's origins, arguing that she did exist in cults within the Mycenaean Greece. And they start first by dissecting the etymology of her name in terms of the Greek language, arguing that her name may derive from the name Hekatos, an obscure epithet of Apollo, and interpreted as the far-reaching one or the far darter. Now, this epithet, they argue, brings her into the identifying realms of Artemis, who's strongly associated with Apollo and, as we've already discussed, frequently equated with Hecate. Supporters of this etymology suggest that Hecate was originally considered an aspect of Artemis prior to the latter's adoption into the Olympian pantheon, when Artemis was more strongly associated with purity and maidenhood, meaning her originally darker attributes, like her association with magic and the souls of the dead and the night, would have been continued to be worshipped separately under the title of Hecate. Fascinating, isn't it? But according to Pausanias, the 2nd century CE Greek traveller, the island of Aegina had a mystery cult dedicated to the goddess, where it is believed that those suffering from mental illnesses could be cured. Kos, Erythrae, and Samothrace, Thessaly, and Meletos also worshipped the goddess, with the later having a 6th century BCE circular altar at the Delphinion, a temple dedicated to Apollo, for sacrifices to be made in her honour, which are the earliest archaeological evidence of her worship. There was also an area sacred to Hecate in the precincts of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, where the priests, which it's Megabyzi or Megabyzi, but to me, when I see it written, I just want to say mega boys, which is why I laughed. Basically, what they officiated, the mega boys. So this sanctuary was called the Hecatean, the shrine of Hecate. Additionally, according to Pausanias, Hecate was worshipped in the temple of Athena in Titan. Quote, in Titan, there is also a sanctuary of Athena, into which they bring up the image of Coronis, which is the mother of Asclepius. The sanctuary is built upon a hill, at the bottom of which is an altar of the winds, and on it the priest sacrifices to the winds one night in every year. He also performs other secret rites of Hecate at 4 pits, taming the fierceness of the blasts, quote, of the winds, and he is said to chant, as well as the charms of Medea. Additionally, there is a holy cave on the island of Samothrace, known as Zerinthos, which is considered an important sanctuary to Hecate. Now, to add to her obscurity, Hecate had unusual rituals performed in her honour. So Hecate's Deipnon, also known as Hecate Supper, was a religious offering meal given to Hecate and the restless dead once a lunar month. The meal included small cakes of eggs, cheese bread, and dog meat, which were lit with miniature torches, or alternatively a dish of red mullet, which was usually prohibited from offerings to the other gods. Most families placed the meal on top of or inside the small shrine to Hecate that they had outside of their door after sunset. And this was because the street in front of their house and the doorway into the home created a 3-way crossroads, which was obviously sacred to Hecate. Of course, this meant that the meals were often eaten by those in extreme poverty who happened to be passing those houses at that night, and as Aristophanes wrote, quote, ask Hecate whether it is better to be rich or starving, she will tell you that the rich send her a meal every month and that the poor make it disappear before it is even served. The ancient Athenians performed this ritual because they believed, once a month, that Hecate led the spirits of the unavenged or wrongfully killed, accompanied by hounds from the underworld up to Hades, and the meal was to placate the soul's longing for vengeance, because no one wants a hangry ghost. Additionally, the meal was done to purify the household and to atone for bad deeds a household member may have committed to offend Hecate, causing her to withhold her favour from them. It's also the last day of the month according to the lunisolar-based Attic calendar used in ancient Athens, where the time of the dark moon was seen as an in-between liminal time between the months. Now, because they believed the vengeful spirits were roaming the earth, Athenians didn't leave their homes during the Deipnon, and the home afterwards was purified by fumigation and the removal of, quote, leftovers from offerings and sacrifices. The ancient Greeks fumigated their homes by carrying a baked clay censer of incense throughout the house before depositing it at the crossroads or shrine as an offering, and it was never used again because it was considered a, quote, leftover from the ritual. Other such leftovers included incense ashes and the ashes from the sacrifices that their family altar, waste blood, lovely, and any remaining food that have fallen onto the floor. Because as the food fell onto the floor, it was stressed that you don't pick it up, because according to the ritual, it was never to be picked up, as it already passed on to Hecate, and she would then redistribute it amongst the spirits. It's also worth noting that Hecate was worshipped in Byzantium. So according to a tale in the Suda, which is a 10th century Byzantium encyclopedia, she was said to have saved the city from Philip II of Macedon. As Hecate Phosphorus, the star Venus, she is said to have lit the sky during the siege of Philip II in 340 BCE, revealing the attack to its inhabitants. And as a thank you, the Byzantines dedicated a statue to her as the lamp carrier, and Hecate is known as Hecate Lampidephoros. And finally, according to Hesiod of Miletus, there was once a statue of Hecate at the site of the Hippodrome in Constantinople. And that is my incredibly long essay on the background to Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft, in ancient Greece, and a touch of it in ancient Rome. And you know what? Even I did not know when I started this that my name is associated with Hecate, so now I just feel more connected to her. Even though I personally identify with the Grim Reaper more than anything, I'll take being nominally associated with Hecate as well. I feel like that goes with my nature. But yes, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Thank you Skillshare for sponsoring today's episode, and thank you to my patrons for making today's episode possible. I hope you don't mind if there's another voiceover today. It's just there was a lot of text, and it's much less anxiety inducing to have a camera rolling whilst you're going through all the hard words that you don't know how to pronounce. But thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you soon for another video. And remember, books save lives, so keep reading.